Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the 8th session of Socially Generative Innovation for Development. We're glad to have Dr. Sara Biswas again this morning for part B of Data for Generative Systems, Characterizing Complexity. Sara, it's all yours.
Thank you. Welcome back, everyone. So we will continue from the discussion last time on social value of energy, or generally mapping social value. And this is the multi-layered approach that we had discussed before, is building on the understanding of what is socially valuable for end users. And so the next level that tries to complete the picture is to understand the complexity of the system within which social value is situated. Before we go ahead, a quick recap of what we had discussed and some of the key highlights of the discussion so far. And I would summarize them as what we have understood as the purposes of collecting data for research and projects, particularly as it concerns innovation for development. The principal purpose of data, as we have understood, is to frame and reframe the problems or the questions that we are interested in. As we understand the problem, we start to learn more about it and collect data, and that helps us refine the questions and pose much more pointed questions to the problem. The second purpose is to reflect and evaluate the designs of the solutions we propose and implement. So as solution, we have discussed that there is no silver bullet solutions to particularly the kind of complex problems we're dealing with. So it's a process of discovery and it's a process of learning. Hence, reflection and evaluations of the actions and the outcomes is a critical element of innovation for development, and hence data generated as we go forward with implementing designs, it helps us reflect and evaluate the designs themselves. Once we have implemented solutions and we are experiencing the outcomes, it's important to characterize and measure outcomes. As you have all understood so far, is in the complex landscape of innovation for development, there are certain outcomes which are planned, but there is a large number of outcomes which were unplanned or emerge as the problem and the solutions evolve together. So it's important to have the tools to characterize those outcomes and have objective criteria for measuring those outcomes. And finally, once we do all the three above, we obviously identify follow-on and complementary investigations in action that are either filling gaps that were not that were highlighted or were not able to be addressed in the primary intervention or solution, and identify newer areas that emerge and create complementary studies and projects for those areas. So far, we have discussed that the problem or the question of infrastructure and human development is a layered, interdependent, and interactive problem, which means that there are levels to the problem and the solutions. There are different entities or agents, as we have called them, involved in the formation of the problem as well as the solution. They function interdependently. Yes, there is an element of independence, but there is a large element of interdependence as well. And these are interactive. So there are different forms of transfer of information or communication that happens between the different layers, which further creates complications. And for these reasons, the infrastructure and development questions and problems and solutions are complex. Before we dive further into understanding the data needs, let's conduct a thought experiment in how to make sense of complexity or complex problems. right? So I would need your attention. So there are certain questions I would pose to you, and I would like you to think through them. You don't necessarily have to give answers, but think about it. So what you see is a ball of yarn. This is obviously made up of different kinds of threads. It's not one thread. So the question I'm posing to you is, if we were to make sense of this yarn, if we were to understand how the different threads are tangled, in what ways this could be understood. Remember, we're not talking about untangling this ball of yarn. We want to understand primarily in what ways these are connected, how the threads are interconnected, and if we pull the one or two threads, in what ways will the shape of the yarn change? We are not trying to simply untangle it. So with this thread of yarn, I would like you to imagine, how would you pull them apart and try to understand the interconnections and the shape of this? Obviously, from visual examination, it seems like a sphere, but you know that this shape can change. So how would you, using your two bare hands, try to figure out the connections and dependencies and the ways the shape can be modified for this ball of yarn? Now, one way, and the simplest way, would be to find the ends, find two independent ends, and try to pull them apart and see how the ball further tangles, or does it untangle? Now, there are two things that can possibly happen here. One, if you pull the two ends apart, the yarn would start to unwrap itself and stretch out into a straight string. In most cases, it won't be the case. It would end up in a further tighter tangle at the center. Now, the second thing that would happen here is, when you tug at one end, you could feel the pull on your other hand, but there might also be the case that you tug at one end and you don't feel the pull at the other hand. So your pull is getting lost in that mess at the center. Now, this is typical of trying to identify a two-dimensional solution to complex problems, where we identify two ends of the problem and we try to pull them at the same time. We do not know that if they have a mutual effect on each other or not, because at the center is a complicated or a complex mess where the push and pull is getting lost. But because we have two ends, we try to manufacture an answer about the problem using those two ends as proxies. So that's one big challenge of trying to answer complex problems in a two-dimensional way. The other thing that can happen is, you might not find the end. You randomly pick 2 points in this yarn and try to pull them apart. Now, my question to you here is, if this is the approach that you're taking, what different shapes are you able to create with pulling with your two hands? I'll give you a few seconds to think about it. What different shapes are possible? Remember, we are using shapes as an analog to understanding the structure of the problem. So again, it might be very obvious to you that in whatever direction you may pull, it would always be a two-dimensional shape. There is not much possibility of creating different kinds of shapes, particularly in 3 dimensions using two hands. This is a principal challenge in trying to make sense or untangling complexity, is that a traditional way of understanding and knowledge makes us think of problems as two-dimensional. There is a cause and there is an effect. In complex problems, the cause and effect approach to knowledge and understanding does not usually work because of what you have just thought about. Now imagine you have help. You have additional pairs of hands trying to untangle this massive yarn. And now you're able to create many more different kinds of shapes. You have at least if you have at least 2 pairs of hands, you are able to create 3-dimensional shapes, pull and tug at different ends and try to understand the structure of this mess. Well, you perhaps are not able to disentangle and unwrap and just pull out individual strings yet, but you have a better sense of what shapes this problem can take. What are the different push and pull that are acting here? And if you pull in one direction, what else would get disturbed? That's the purpose of investigating complex problem, is to, as we have discussed before, the primary purpose of data is to characterize, frame, and reframe the problems in many different ways, because here is an entangled mess of multiple perspectives, objectives, and positionality. Now, apply this analog to the problem of infrastructure and development. Now, this is a simplified schematic, but as we have seen before, this is a multi-dimensional structure. Depending upon in how many ways you pull it, this structure can take multiple different shapes. So what's necessary here is to have a grounding perspective, a purpose, and then try to pull the shape around that purpose. In the previous discussions, we have discussed the purpose of our investigation is to create social value for the end users. So at the core of our investigation is this purpose of trying to link human well-being or poverty to the different infrastructure services and infrastructure dimensions of society. This could be the energy system, water and sanitation, education, economic activity, livelihood, food, and any other kind of infrastructural system that exists in a particular society as it pertains to the well-being, pursuing the well-being outcomes of communities and individuals. Of course, these are mediated by different sets of capabilities, social capital, and the softer, as it is sometimes called, the softer infrastructure of society. So this is the purpose, and we have come up with the social value maps as a tool to understand these interactions as it happens directly between the end users and the infrastructure system and services. Now we start to pull this apart, and we try to pull this in different dimensions. So again, taking the energy system as our system of interest here, we start to pull this complexity apart and unwrap and deconstruct the different layers and the different aspects to this. So in the picture you see here is the framework of energy poverty nexus, where at the core we have the human well-being and its dimensions as our focus. And around it, we are trying to pull apart the different levels of social, technical, infrastructural, and governance layers that are connected to the idea or the phenomena of the production, distribution, consumption, and utilization of energy to pursue well-being. These different layers interact with each other and are composed of individual agents themselves. And this is what we have discussed before as the socio-technical, or in this case, the socio-energy system, made up of agents and actors which are social, ranging from individuals to organizations made up of groups of people, as well as infrastructures and institutions that have a final purpose. Now, if the problem that you're interested in falls in the infrastructure domain of water, falls in the infrastructure domain of work and livelihood or education, the same approach, the same concept can be transferred over, and that particular infrastructure domain can be deconstructed using this framework. Now, this infrastructural or socio-technical framework is not independent of the human elements or non-material factors of human and situational subjectivity, which would mean culture, which would mean values of the particular place, the ethical considerations of people, the people-nature relationship, particularly in infrastructural domains like energy. It is a critical factor. How knowledge is produced, stored, and transferred in that particular society are various human and situational factors that influence the actions of individuals and social actors in this makeup. So with this framework in mind and splitting the question into various layers, we are now in a position to apply data processes that reveal dynamics within these layers and across these layers, and helps us build a better and more complete picture of these interactions over the social value of energy maps that we have developed before. The social value of energy map and the convergence of other data points from the different layers uh, builds a better picture of the dynamic interactions between these multiple layers as they lead towards creating higher value for individuals and communities. So what are the different kinds of data processes possible? Now, if someone was interested in understanding the role of political ecology, political economy, the ecology and climate change in general on the infrastructure and human well-being, one can apply macro level investigations of the technology regimes on climate change and its impact on technological processes, the politics and political economy, trade policy, etc. These are various kinds of studies that are applicable to the macro level or the macro layers that are more global in nature. These would lead to more quantified studies of cause and effect. These would lead to what kind of future pathways exist for collective entities like nations or technology markets or regions. A second kind of investigation can be applied to the meso and macro level of this layered structure. So this might range from the investigation of the electricity infrastructure, the poles, the wires, the devices, its technology and their economics, what changes would create transitions in the infrastructure, and how does it pertain to ownership, financing, and governance regimes in that particular situation. So these are more localized, more regional studies that would lead to identification of parameters that are of importance to this intermediate or meso-level layers of the socio-energy system, and reveal certain dynamics about the nexus. So here, the well-being of individuals is not as granular as we have created in using our social value of energy maps. It's more average and aggregated numbers that are still being considered here. If we are interested in understanding the effects, the mutual effects of changes in infrastructure and governance and financing on human well-being. A third kind of micro-level investigations can be bottom-up investigations, where the interactions between the social value map that we have created before and the immediate infrastructural and governance structures are being conducted. So this would mean the interaction of electricity supply, efficiency parameters, governance and policies and programs at the local level, and their impact on the different dimensions of human well-being. A fourth kind of qualitative investigations is again possible, where we investigate the relationship between the human and cultural factors that surround these systems with the more infrastructural um, aspects of this nexus. So this could mean studies or qualitative narratives on social justice, culture, use patterns, aspirations, and values and ethics can take place here. So, and these are only a few. So these can be multiple because the layers can be broken up and disaggregated in many different ways. The investigations can be multiple. Have here is structure enables us to apply different kinds of data processes, different kinds of methodological approaches, a near whole picture and converge them and create a narrative of the dynamics of socio-technical interaction of human development and well-being. So what we are able to achieve by converging these different analysis and these different types of data that we generated by our investigation, textual and grounded understanding of this dynamic, a better understanding of how difference of the system involve is that they are not static, and as action happens over time, the mutual changes happening. The question of heterogeneity versus homogeneity. We want our investigation to be broad enough and granular enough to understand individual agents, but we also want the picture to tell us how it aggregates and shifts as a layer of the system together. We are able to accommodate different kinds of perspectives and different kinds of skills and disciplinaries on this. And we are eventually able to have a more proactive, anticipatory quality in what ways the system can change and create well-being outcomes. And as I mentioned before, I use energy system here as a system of interest, but the energy system can be replaced by any other system of interest, and a similar investigation can be conducted using that. Now, this is something that we will delve deeper into in forthcoming sessions, but I just wanted to give you a summary of how this kind of data using a Nexus framework can be utilized. So primarily, it helps us better frame development problems as a nexus of various elements, which is focused on the creation of social value for end users. It helps characterize interdependencies among different factors, among different elements of the system, and helps you, at least for a short time, isolate two or more subsystems and analyze them independently of the greater problem and bring that insight to and correlate the greater problem. From a design standpoint, designing solution standpoint, this helps identify the changes or the modifications or the disruptions that are required to create transitions, and what potential scenarios can they lead to. So if the goal is to reimagine the relationship of energy infrastructure and human well-being, such an analysis would tell the designer are those variables that can be changed? What are those variables that have potential consequences when modified? And what are some of the variables that are already underperforming or pulling the system back and needs to be disrupted? And once these solutions are in process, or are the scenarios that are generated used from this transition pathways and modifications of variables, we are able to evaluate whether these scenarios are generative or extractive of social value for the end users. Now, in each of the layers, we have identified certain variables, and we have the ability to cross-link and evaluate uh, changes in each variable category as it pertains to outcomes. So it would give us the anticipatory ability to evaluate whether the changes would be generative, that means create higher well-being outcomes for our end users, or maybe extractive. So we might have an efficient and more sophisticated energy infrastructure, but that won't necessarily mean better human well-being outcomes. A layered approach lets us conduct those kind of evaluations before these are actually implemented. There is a large degree of uncertainty because, as we have discussed before, there is the question of emergence, there is a question of emergent phenomena and outcomes, which would always be the case. However, the degree of uncertainty can be reduced greatly if a multimodal, multidimensional data approach is taken and then is fed into our analytical framework of the Nexus. So I know this is a lot to digest, and you might have more questions than answers. So at this point, I would like to discuss your questions before we move ahead to the understanding of the analysis and the different data forms here. So questions or thoughts?
Sure. I'm wondering, we keep talking a lot about the energy poverty nexus, but I've never heard or seen a full, you could say like a discussion, what are its characteristics and so. Can you maybe give us a quick overview of what we would expect to be looking at that if we're trying to identify what is this nexus and what are its characteristics?
So let me understand your question better. So what I understand is that you are trying to look at indicators. You're trying to find indicators of what would signify an energy poverty nexus. Is that what your question is?
Yes, generally, yes.
Right. So, understanding a nexus, not just energy poverty nexus, but any form of nexus is a layered inquiry. You find certain phenomena which indicate towards problems which are deep set and are not answerable by simple cause and effect explanations, are particularly the kind of indicators that point to the need for a deeper investigation into the nexus. For example, something that you might be familiar with is the phenomena of energy theft or electricity theft. Now, it's very common to explain electricity theft as purely an action of consumption and the inability to pay. Those are the two variables usually used to explain electricity theft. But if you look at the demographic, if you look at the service conditions that are the electricity service conditions that are applicable to that particular demographic, and you look at the temporal pattern of what is characterized as theft, would lead you down different explanations, sometimes which are mutually conflicting, and sometimes which would help you create that bigger picture. So, assuming I go into a situation where there is a reported phenomena of electricity theft, how would you start to investigate that problem and try to frame that problem? Remember, we are still not trying to put forward a solution for stopping electricity theft, but what we are trying to do is understand why and how and where electricity theft happens. So how would you approach that problem if you were to investigate that deep in a deeper way, in deeper fashion?
I guess you'd have to be looking at the both the physical infrastructure as well as the social and economic infrastructure of the general thing. Because interestingly, in Guyana, the electricity theft, you'd be surprised lots of times the people who are more involved in electricity theft are some of the larger manufacturing and the commercial entities. So there's also issues of collusion between the employees of the say the electricity company and these large business people and all of that. So it's as you said, it's very complex and integrated, and I think that's something that we always overlook when we talk about electricity. This is just an aside. Lots of large entities are heavily involved in electricity theft too, not just simply the people at the margins who, for various reasons, really cannot afford it. That's a simple form. So as you said, it's complex, but that would be which part of those things would be the nexus, though, with the energy poverty nexus?
Right. So once you have, that created that preliminary understanding that this is not, there's no simple explanation for this, and there are consequences for energy theft. It could be direct punitive action that disproportionately affects certain groups, or it could be the overall weakening of the energy supply system, which again impacts disproportionately a group of consumers, probably not the ones who are able to afford and who are able to bypass mechanisms to maintain continuity of service. That creates the nexus. Now, the energy poverty nexus as a term, as a concept, signifies the relationship between the infrastructural aspects and the human aspect. So poverty being a very human phenomena, and energy system largely being an infrastructure phenomena. So the concept signifies that interdependency and interlinkage between the infrastructural and the human outcomes. Now, the way to approach is like we just found out is to identify surface phenomena that indicates towards greater problems, and trying to approach the surface phenomena from multiple dimensions and looking at how deep it goes and where are the final impacts being created because of that phenomena revealed. So eventually, when you delve deeper into electricity theft, the mere phenomena of theft or the loss of revenue from not receiving payments for the service largely becomes immaterial. But what comes up are the factors of collusion, the variables of the political structure, the approaches to knowledge, which classifies consumers into different categories based on their consumption and ability to pay parameters. Those are the variables that become more important and more relevant to the understanding of this interrelationship between the energy system and poverty.
Hi, Sarah. Great presentation so far. I have a question, please. As you know, utilities and governments all over the world generally are not keen on extending electricity grids to provide power to a few residents who would be beyond that grid and at the margins. Would that fit into that this conversation, that phenomenon? Is that applicable here? You got the point, Saurabh, Dr. Saurabh?
Yes. I think Clark has a comment, so I'll let him speak and then I'll probably get to your question.
Okay.
Well, I had a thought on this question and more generally on the energy poverty nexus. I think it does apply here. And so let me offer a kind of a high level thought on Patrick's question and then come back to yours, Chema. When we think about the energy poverty nexus, which y'all will recall, we had a discussion of the more general technology or infrastructure nexus with poverty 5 or 6 weeks ago. So you're welcome to go back and look at that again as well. But the general idea is that there's a feedback loop that's happening. So one direction of that feedback loop is that the energy system, the way that we've constructed it and structured it, is contributing to making people's lives worse off in some respect. And in turn, we can say it's helping to create or perpetuate or exacerbate economic insecurity, for example. And then in vice versa, right? People's economic insecurity, their lack of income or whatever, is in turn contributing to the inadequacies of the energy system, or the failure of the energy system to contribute positively to their lives, right? So you've got a bi-directional relationship going on in some respect. And what Saurabh is describing for you in this image is the full array of elements across all these different layers that could be contributing to those feedback loops. But at the core, in any particular circumstance, there's a bi-directional feedback loop that's going on. And that feedback loop is negative, right? It's worsening over time. It's spiraling downwards. Now, it may not be spiraling downwards very fast, but it's spiraling downwards. So I think, Patrick, what you're looking for when you're looking for indicators that perhaps there's some sort of energy poverty nexus happening in a community, you're looking for indicators that the community is continuing to struggle in some respects, and that energy is part of why they're continuing to struggle, whether that's economically or socially or in terms of their health or their well-being, right? It could be a whole variety of things. But we see that community in poverty and maybe even in extreme poverty on an ongoing and long-term basis. And then we're looking for is that related to the way that we've put the energy system together, right? And so for many communities, Jomo, being outside of the existing energy system is especially the electricity system. I mean, all communities have energy systems, right? Whether that's based on human labor or animal labor or fuels that they buy or firewood that they collect or electricity, right? Those are all energy systems and they all contribute to making things go. But in the kind of modern economic setting where electricity is widespread, being outside the electricity system is first off often clearly an indicator of poverty, right? It's being caused in part by the fact that this community doesn't have a strong economy in the first place. So it's not going to use a lot of electricity. So you're not going to get a lot of benefits as a utility or a government from extending that line out into that community. You have a community that probably doesn't have a lot of political power either, right? So its status as a marginal community is also contributing to its inability to leverage the government to say, you really need to provide us with electricity. It's kind of obligatory upon, energy is a right, as some people would say these days. But this community that you're looking at that's outside the electricity system doesn't have the leverage, the power, the influence to get the government to extend that line out to them. And in turn, right, the lack of electricity is then contributing to their inability to run equipment that might help them process their agricultural products to a higher state, therefore sell them for more money in the marketplace, or have higher levels of agricultural production so they have more of them to sell, right? And so it's acting as a brake, a limit on their ability to expand their economy in ways that would allow them to either acquire enough income and enough economic activity to justify extending that line, or enough political influence that they could get that line extended. So I think that's a really good example of how a kind of structural condition can get set up in which low-income communities stay low income because in part because they're not able to get access to a resource that for many other communities in their country is helping accelerate economic growth and change and development in that community. So I think that's a good example. You can also see good examples around, say, energy efficiency, where there's something of an expectation that over time households in robust electrical systems are able to invest in better and more efficient equipment over time, which reduces their energy needs and therefore reduces their energy expenses, which gives them more income to invest in other areas, whether that's to invest in their business or to invest in education for their kids or other things that would grow the household's capabilities or grow the business's capabilities and so forth, right? So that the ability to upgrade to more efficient energy equipment is part of what drives a virtuous circle, the reverse of an energy poverty nexus, a positive feedback loop between economic growth or human well-being and a better energy system over time coupled together. But we often find in low-income households that there's a whole passel of reasons why they can't make those same energy efficiency upgrades. Maybe they're renting, so they don't own the home, so they're not allowed to invest in those energy efficiency upgrades. Maybe they can't get access to the upfront capital that they need or the credit that they would need to buy that more efficient piece of equipment. And so instead, here in Arizona, what we often find is that they continually repair their air conditioning equipment, which is our big energy user here. And over time, it decreases in efficiency. It doesn't increase in efficiency. It gets worse, and they replace parts of it with parts that don't match the other parts, and that makes it more inefficient over time. You end up with these really inefficient air conditioning systems in the least well-off households. And as a result, they often have the highest electricity bills, which is further draining economic resources from those households. So you see how these negative feedback loops work over time to make people's lives harder and harder to be successful. Whereas if you can reverse them, if you can get these positive feedback loops going, where energy is generative, or any kind of technology that you're investing in is generative, then that positive feedback is growing over time. And what Saurabh is trying to lay out for you here is all of the different complexities that can contribute to those positive feedback loops or those negative feedback loops. And that's why you got to untangle them, is to figure out what exactly in any given circumstance is driving either a negative feedback loop or might drive in the future a positive feedback loop.
Prasamsa, just one comment before you ask your question. So a key thing, Jomo, that the Nexus of framing lets you do, and if you reflect on the way you framed your question, that governments find no incentive in extending grids to communities. So if I take your question and place it in this framework, your question is probably somewhere in the top 2 or 3 layers. Now, the way Clark responded and the way Clark explained to you the question, his response was grounded in the bottom layer of the development and the well-being of the community. Now, this is what the Nexus framework lets you do, that instead of posing a question in isolation, it grounds it to this idea of well-being, which we have already established a baseline for using the social value map. So the idea of Nexus makes sense only when predicated on the idea of creating social value for an identified group of individuals or communities. Otherwise, it's very easy to say everything is connected to everything, but we don't know in what ways. So the Nexus or a systems approach or a complexity approach makes sense only when it is grounded in a purpose. And in this case, the purpose is to create social value or well-being outcomes for individuals and communities. Your question becomes relevant then. Otherwise, it's a question in isolation, which can only be answered then by variables and parameters that are relevant to that particular layer, which would again be cost, efficiency, technological choices and possibilities.
Thanks, Dr. Saurabh. I agree. Make a lot of sense there.
Yep. Sorry, Prasamsa. Yes, your question.
Okay. So I wanted to ask a few questions. My first question being, can we use this model for an introduced energy technology such as solar? And another thing is, as I'm particularly focusing on solar irrigation pumps, and I want to see its extractive or generative patterns, I would be focusing more on water, energy, and food, and also on the economic gain of the farmer. So I have multiple dimensions around the solar which I want to see. So the presented figure here is about energy and poverty nexus. So can I use this? I am particularly interested on the micro level investigation, the one with the bottom up approach. So can I use that to see whether this technology placed in the ground is generative or extractive? And if you have some comments on doing that, then can I have that?
I think you can absolutely do that. In fact, the background work that has happened behind the development of the energy poverty nexus framework and social value of energy as a toolkit and as a conceptual approach is largely grounded in projects like that, investigations like that, where we have focused on decentralized energy sources and its interaction with overall sustainable development in communities. That obviously involves food, economic activity, water, climate resilience.
Yeah.
So generally, yes, absolutely. This is one of the key areas of application for this nexus. But also, once again, a reminder that technology cannot be the central actor in this framework. In fact, there is no central actor. This is what can be called as a polycentric system. The principal focus, though, here is the well-being and social value creation for individuals and communities. Because, and that's why we call it a people-centered or user-centered approach, where we are focusing on outcomes rather than centering it on technology or infrastructure.
Okay, thank you. So another one. So if I were to have let's say energy and water and food and then people well-being, then how am I going to incorporate all four of those aspects into this scenarios?
Well, so I would begin by creating the social value maps for your community of interest and understand their value proposition as it pertains to food, water, and energy as services or as activities. And from there, I would start to deconstruct the different layers that makes up each of these three different infrastructural services in the community and try to identify overlaps or separations between the different layers that compose each of the three infrastructure areas.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, and then it's also for you to set boundaries. How far do you want to extend the investigation? Do you want to look at the deconstruction of these infrastructures up to a regional or local level? That would involve a different set of entities, governance institutions, and policy framework. Or do you want to extend the interdependencies question up to a national or a global scale? So those are boundary questions you would have to decide, and depending upon your constraints on gathering data, you would have to set boundaries for those the limits until where the deconstruction process can happen.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Saurav.
Any other questions?
Well, if not, Saurabh, thank you very much. This was great.
Yeah.
And it was great to see everybody, and we will look forward to seeing you all next week. Have a good week, everybody.
Thank you.
Okay, thank
you,
you.
everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Goodbye.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It was really good. Thank you.